So that's the Apple company filings that I've provided. I've also provided you what the street thinks. This is important for framing our forecast. As I talked about earlier, we're not going to expect that you're experts in Apple. And quite often when you're in investment banking, there's no expectation for you becoming an expert in something. Even if you're on the buy side, one of the first things that you want to do is just establish what is the street view of this business. So even if you are expected to really understand and come up with an investment thesis on the buy side, where it really matters what your ultimate forecasts are going to look like, you really quite often frame things in relation to what is the street case. And so the street case quite often involves the process of taking an equity research report or two. I've provided you here the JP Morgan research report that talks about what their expectations are for Apple going forward over the next couple of years. I've also given you a second equity research report, which we'll need later on, not maybe so much up front. We're going to rely really pretty heavily on the JP Morgan research. Whenever you're picking an equity research report, if you have the luxury of gaining access to these reports, you always want to look for reports that have nice screenshots of full models, because these give you forecasts that are much richer and deeper than reports without models. And I've also given you, in addition to just picking one or two equity research reports, I've also given you consensus estimates. This comes from Capital IQ. You'd also have access to it with FactSet. And this is a survey of how what all equity research analysts think about Apple's forecast over the next several years. So I'm going to show you what these look like. So I've given you a PDF with a whole bunch of equity research. Two of the reports are the ones we're going to use. The first one is the February 4th JP Morgan research report, and that's on page 14 here. And here you see it. And at the very bottom of it, there is a screenshot, and I've actually pre-highlighted some things that we're going to piggyback later on. But just so you see, here's revenue for historically what's happened, 2017, 2018, but then 2019, they're showing you their expectations for the next 3 years. So we're gonna rely on that. We're gonna have to come up with some ideas about what to do beyond the next 3 years, because equity research tends to be a little shorter term, like 2 or 3 years, whereas we need forecasts now for 5 years, so we'll have to think about that. And I've given you another model that we're going to use, a Canaccord Genuity that came out several days before our hypothetical date of our case study, February 5th. So this came a week before. We're going to use that. They've got some good detail about sort of segment level data. The last thing that I want to show you is this consensus, the Cap IQ consensus that I've provided. This is when you download consensus from Capital IQ. Let me unfreeze this so you see what the whole document. I've given you a document like this, and this is basically an aggregate of all of the street, all the sell-side equity research forecasts for how Apple's going to do. So there's a whole bunch of sort of summary data here, but the thing we're going to spend most of our time thinking about, and now I will freeze the pane here so you can see more clearly, is this came straight from Cap IQ. I can show you in a second where it came from, but it's a download that tells you, okay, well, historically, this is what's happened. The A stands for actuals, but going forward, we've got surveys from 41 analysts, street analysts, and we've averaged that they expect earnings per share for Apple of $11.47, the next year $12.83, and on it goes. One thing to note is notice how the first 2 years there's about 41 analysts submitting estimates that we can average and get a really good sort of data set about what the street thinks, quote unquote, whereas it kind of drops off a cliff after that. Part of that is what I just said a minute ago, where sell-side research is really focused on the next quarter, the next year, maybe 2 years from now, 2 years out, because they're catering to long-term investors that are sort of shorter term focused. This creates a bit of a problem for us because we can't really rely on these forecasts that much anymore. We have to start doing our own work, which we will absolutely do as we get to the modeling. I did want to show you one other thing here, which is this Excel file that I've given you also has something very important, which is consensus for other things, not just earnings per share, like revenue. So they expect $257 billion in revenue next year. Notice that's a significant drop from last year's revenue of $265. Right, so there's things happening here that we're gonna, that the street thinks. We're gonna have to look at what JP Morgan says, sanity check it against what the street thinks, and now let's talk about the modeling that we're about to embark on.